Guia de estilo e instruções para síntese de fala. Este é o início da mensagem. Comece com energia total e um tom de comando, capturando a atenção imediatamente. The bet happened over a piano harp of ice and laughter, the kind of laughter that belongs to people who have never had to count their losses. Lucas Marshall smiled as if the world bowed for him. His suit was the exact shade of gray that made other men look ordinary. He had been raised on deals and deadlines, taught to move people as bishops on a board of polished wood. And tonight, the boardroom had melted into the skyline, a laver of light and glass where everyone else orbited him. Jack set the terms with a casual bite. Find out if the woman at the bar who refuses his drink will ever bend. And if you win, he would underwrite Lucas's next hobby, another acquisition, another monument to a life that answered with profit. Around them, the city hummed like a living thing, windows like eyes that never closed. If you're watching this all the way through, stay until the end. If this story grips you, please like and subscribe for more. There's a question at the center of it that I want you to consider, and I promise it's worth seeing how it ends. She stood with a coffee cup in both hands, as if she were holding a small animal. Chloe Richards did not belong to the room. Her dress was uncomplicated, her laugh economical, and her attention lived in the lines around people's mouths rather than their luxury. Lucas noticed everything. He noticed the way she refused to be impressed, and that fact felt like a fresh challenge. When he approached, it was with the practiced ease of someone who had never rehearsed vulnerability, and therefore made no effort to conceal the hardness underneath charm. "You're a hard sell," Chloe said, without looking up. "Is that a diagnosis?" Lucas asked, letting the whiskey-sweet world of the party hover around his voice. "Observation," she said. Her eyes were honest in the way that most lies look unnecessary. You think the right words will make people bend. They don't. It was supposed to be trivial, a game between two men who measured everything in margins. But there is always, in those small arms of risk, the unseen cord that pulls the world taut. The bet was sealed with an amused clink of ice and an invitation that slid like a covert blade beneath humor. Lucas would charm Chloe for 3 months, and then he would ask her to marry him. The terms were absurd and precise. No coercion, no lies. Only a deliberate orchestration of proximity until habit or affection or boredom did the rest. Jack laughed loud enough to be sure people heard the punchline. On the glass balcony, the city seemed near enough to be toyed with. Chloe accepted the invitation to coffee the next morning as if it were a transaction. She obliged not because she expected something from him, but because she liked to see how people acted when they assumed the world owed them things. She told him, over a cheap table by a diner window, that she worked 3 jobs to support a mother who had become small with worry, and that she had learned to keep her heart out of investment-grade risks. "You're very practiced," Lucas said later that week, after they had sat through a gallery opening and a Sunday brunch where he kept seeing his reflection in the polished cutlery. "Practice is what makes you survive when the world cheats you," Chloe said. "You can practice being cruel. People practice being generous too." The coldness in Chloe was not absence. It was a chosen armor. Lucas, who had always seen people's reactions as moves on a board, misread her restraint as a flaw he could repair. He began, almost imperceptibly at first, to use the tools he had always used: favors arranged by friends, whispered suggestions at parties, a few well-placed donations that bent committees towards his causes. In meetings, he framed intimacy as inevitability, gestures that looked like thoughtfulness but were rehearsed to exert control. He sent peonies, pale and deliberate, to her building with a note that said something small and dangerous. "There is someone who sees you." They married before either of them fully understood how the bet had begun to feel like something else, a choreography where liberties were traded for the illusion of connection. The ceremony was tasteful, the reception glossy. Lucas's friends cheered as if they had sponsored the whole scene, and Chloe's face was a portrait of contained storms. There were toasts that spoke of partnership in the abstract. No one asked the heavy questions. How did a woman who kept her hands on her purse all evening consent to vows that asked for everything? How did a man who hardly slept learn how to be seen? For Lucas, marriage was another victory at first. Chloe beside him at charity galas, her presence a proof that he could transform any obstacle into an asset. It did not occur to him that gifts worn like armor might later become evidence. He gave her a penthouse corner office view for a workspace that was mostly a place to practice being domestic in front of guests. He orchestrated small surprises, late-night takeout that tasted like apologies that became neat patterns, until habit shaded into ownership. Chloe performed a different kind of labor. She kept her boundaries, then softened them in ways that allowed for quiet observation. Inside that softness, she was collecting data, watching the man who had made history into a series of transactions. The first rupture was public and small. A smear piece about one of Lucas's enterprises folding a small chain of family-run coffee shops into a ghost of itself. He called it consolidation, neat and clinical. For the families who had built their lives around those shops, the word was violence. Chloe read the names on the notice board at the community center. She watched a woman with time-worn hands fold up a sweater as if wrapping up a life. Fold up a sweater as if wrapping up a life. The story did not reach Lucas's office at first. His world had buffers of lawyers and press managers, but it reached Chloe's kitchen table and later her nights. She began to withdraw in calibrated measures. Fewer dinners, more refusals, long appointments with work that stretched into silence. Lucas, used to immediate compliance, created an internal narrative where her resistance was temporary, where surely she would be grateful for the comforts he had conferred. When she finally confronted him in the penthouse, the room felt colder than any storm. "You don't know what you look like to the people you push," she said. She had put her hands on the glass of the balcony and was watching the city breathe. "You think it's all chess. You think people are moves." Lucas's answer was practiced levity. "People are assets if they're reliable." Chloe turned. For once, she did not mask the blade beneath decorum. "You destroyed my family's business," she said, and the words dropped like stones. "And when they couldn't pay rent, when my father couldn't stand being told he was obsolete, She stopped. The sentence hung half-written in the air. She was not theatrical. She had never been theatrical. She had learned to save theatricality for precise moments that required it. The confession that followed, fewer than the shorthand of a speech, carried a weight that no corporate memo could ever counter. Her father had become unmoored after the business had been bought out. Tightened strings, missed paychecks, the slow erosion of dignity. And the consequences had been all the world in her small kitchen. That night, between the plates, she told Lucas that a man had died by his own hand. She did not describe how.
She only said that the loss had been absolute and cold, that somewhere on a ledge of rubble or despair, he had chosen to end a life no longer made tolerable by the world's quiet restructuring. Any sane man would have understood then that money could not stitch up that wound. Lucas understood, but only as a ripple against his self-concept. He felt ache, but he felt it through the frame of his empire. Reputations which could be mended, influence which could be reoriented. He reached for damage control. Chloe watched him reach and saw that he did not quite reach the right things. She recoiled and plotted a revenge that would be precisely moral and without spectacle, a vengeance of consequence rather than malice. She pulled files, names, and small stories from the towns the corporation had purchased. She started whispering to the people who had been bruised by his decisions. An accountant who lost her livelihood, a young barista who had left school. She introduced small obstacles, a misfiled invoice here, a late email there. She was patient. Her revenge was a slow architecture of refusal. She withheld the easy softening that might allow Lucas to pass as redeemed. When she refused to relent, the people she'd approached began to speak up.
Small lawsuits formed like slow weather. Whispers became complaints. A photograph of Lucas, once ubiquitous in glossy magazines, was now often paired with the same line, "At what cost?" Lucas noticed the erosion like a fever. He woke at odd hours, his reflection in the dark window of the penthouse looking like a stranger who had been educated to feel superior. Sleep left him. The chessboard of his life began to disassemble into pieces he had thought trivial. Names of employees he had never met, faces that no longer fit his ledger. He tried to buy silence. He offered settlements that smelled like hush. He sent flowers that smelled like apology. But Chloe had taught him, through absence and testimony, the difference between gestures and reparations. When the midpoint truth arrived, it did so like a hard winter. A private family confronted him in his office. The mother who had once held her infant over a bakery counter, standing small and furious. She told him not to call it consolidation, but erasure. The mother's hands trembled as she lit into the ledger with words that could not be quantified. She said that her son had left one morning and not come back. She said they had been evicted. She said they had once laughed over a pie as the boy practiced the route to college. Those pictures, pinned into the wall in Lucas's mind like reproach, broke something in him that no power could buy. Chloe watched his collapse not with triumph, but with a measured sorrow. Revenge had its moral cost. She felt it in the silence after each cut. She had not wanted to make him homeless. She had wanted him to face the cost of what his hands had done. But the world does not always render consequences evenly. When Lucas's empire started to tilt, his allies peeled away. Jack, who had once laughed as if pain were a lubricant to business, watched the fall with a disenchantment that was more mirror than mercy. Accounts that once looked like smooth rivers became droughts. A whistleblower signed papers that made headlines. Reputation, so carefully constructed, disintegrated into shards of headlines and angry interviews. Lucas moved from penthouse bedrooms to hotel rooms with pay-as-you-go check-ins. The city that had been a backdrop to his victories became an arena of loss. One night, after the calls, the legal letters, the small and righteous confrontations where mothers and sons and exhausted employees had laid out the math of harm, Lucas found himself walking streets he had never walked without limos and escorts.
Rain had made the sidewalks shine like burnished coins. The world smelled of fried onions and diesel. A newsstand's neon offered headlines that read like a funeral dirge for his career. The loneliness was a physical thing, a weight in the chest he had never learned to recognize. He slept on benches sometimes, not by design, but by absence. No credit cards accepted, no reservation left. A pattern of doors closed softly in his face.
The stranger's words were not theology dressed in a new suit. They were a practical insistence that change is labor. For Lucas, who had measured every relationship in returns, the idea that repair was a daily, unglamorous work, visiting, confessing, returning funds, listening to things that hurt, landed like a new kind of currency. It was not a promise of clean absolution, but a method, the steady application of small, often humiliating acts performed in service of other people's dignity. He sat there until the sky bled pale and the city sighed awake. The stranger's anonymity kept the encounter from being tidy. Lucas wanted to ask where the man had learned the phrase, "sit through the next dawn," wanted to ask whether he had ever rejoined the world properly, whether he had relatives or a job or forgiveness. But such questions were the old currency of curiosity. The man had given him a principle, not a narrative that could be appropriated. Lucas stood up before dawn and felt the weight of a decision that had not yet hardened. Over the next days, he tried to find the stranger again, like people trying to locate a chapter in a life that matters. He could not. The city keeps its own counsel. People appear and disappear without leaving a record. But the idea remained: to repair. He began in the smallest ways he could think of that were not performative. He went, unannounced, to a storefront where a family had once run a bakery and offered to meet them with no lawyers, no prepared speeches, just indebtedness and a willingness to listen. The first meeting was worse than he imagined. The mother eyed him for a long time, embodying a skepticism that had every right to be absolute. "You lost us our home," she said. "You gave me a number I could not make sense of. People died because of choices like yours." Lucas told her the truth he had not spoken to himself, that he had chosen profit over people, that numbers had looked clean and lives had not. He did not offer platitudes. He offered to make right, to find ways to return what he could, funds to cover expenses, a promise to fund scholarships, a firm commitment to rehire or underwrite job training. He started paperwork himself, learning how nonprofits worked, meeting caseworkers who did not care about his name, but about how fast the money would move. He cut deals that would cost him, selling properties, reducing his shares. He handed checks with signatures that felt like small amputations. He apologized in ways that felt raw and too real. He sat in rooms where his apology did not heal, where it was cataloged and filed as part of a larger ledger of harm. Chloe watched him do these things, as if watching someone unlearn a language. She had not planned to allow him room to perform these acts publicly, to use them as a mirror for friends and former enemies. She had intended him to feel the moral cost. Lucas and Chloe, imperfect and persistent, learned to be part of that luminous, ordinary network. In the months that followed, the work took the shape of a geography. Doorways of nonprofit offices, basements turned into classrooms, the rows of folding chairs at neighborhood centers where people who had never expected to be heard were asked to speak and then listened to. Lucas became practiced at small public rituals, apologizing in plain sentences, signing agreements in blue ink, describing restitution calculations in ways that were neither theatrical nor evasive. He learned to let silence hold when someone else needed to measure him by what he would not say. One morning in late autumn, with the city throwing fistfuls of cold light against the glass towers, he walked to a storefront that had been converted into a workforce hub. The hub smelled of printer toner and coffee gone to the edge of bitter. A placard on the door read, "Local Hiring Cohort," and below it, in a handwriting thick with nervous optimism, someone had taped, "We build work that builds us." Inside, young men and women sat at long tables with laptops and notepads. Some had the careful attentiveness of people attending an exam they couldn't afford to fail. Others carried a slowness that was more defense than lack of skill. Many bore the quiet markings of lives interrupted. Hair cropped the way employers often preferred. Hands that had done heavy labor. Eyes that watched for exits. Lucas introduced an exercise he had learned to trust. Tell us the worst thing your last boss did, and then tell us the one useful thing you learned from the job. It was a small litmus test for approaching work without pretense. A woman near the middle of the room, wearing a threadbare denim jacket, said, "My last boss didn't warn us when he was selling the company. We found out because security escorted us out. But I learned how to keep a ledger tidy, how to make numbers talk so they don't lie." She smiled with teeth that had known both resolve and hunger. Lucas nodded and said, simply, "That skill belongs to you, whether the company sells or not." Later, when the session broke for lunch, a younger man hovered near the door. He wore a jacket with hopeful elbows and hands that shook slightly when he held his cup. He introduced himself as Amir. He said his last job had been in a warehouse run by a contractor who had used temp labor and then folded when a bid went bad. "They made us sign papers that said we weren't employees," he said. "They paid us like we were contractors. When the work stopped, we got nothing." He had a small, earnest way of asking for permission to believe in improvement. Lucas listened and found himself telling a story he had not planned to tell. He spoke of the subway man who had sat down and called him to account, how it had been the first time someone had described his despair and given him room to breathe. "You don't have to trust me because of anything I say," he told Amir. "Trust me because you can check the work. Stay with projects that let you see the math. Stay where the promises are written down and kept visible." Amir's eyes stayed on him for a long moment. "You used to be inside that," he said quietly. "You used to be the one who signed the papers." Lucas could have denied the implication. He chose instead to answer with the labor of a man who had learned to measure restitution in acts rather than slogans. He told Amir which boards and which community funds had overseen the cohort, handed him a list of people to call, and, at the end of the week, arranged a shift for him with a small, cooperatively run logistics company that agreed to hire on probation and pay into a hardship fund. Lucas did not pretend the path would be easy. He promised only steady checking, clear paper trails, and a willingness to step back if the company failed to meet the terms. Word of the hub's modest successes circulated by the slow means of people telling their neighbors and the faster means of municipal newsletters. A city reporter wrote a short piece about restorative employment programs that mentioned Lucas by name. The mention was flat, middle-column journalism, neither triumphalist nor beastly. It changed nothing in the skyline, but shifted the way certain people looked at the hub, as a place that might be co-opted or a place that might be expanded. Expansion arrived as a problem dressed like an opportunity.
One rainy afternoon, a man from a philanthropic foundation asked to meet Lucas in a glassed conference room downtown. The foundation had a glossy report and a line item for scale. "We can help you reach more neighborhoods," the man said, folding the report with hands that suggested a life spent moving papers into other people's hands. "We can amplify the model. We'd even like to feature your face in the campaign." Lucas sat with the damp on his coat and felt, in a way he had not felt in years, the old lure of achievement, the fever for numbers, for growth as proof of worth. He listened as the man described grant cycles, media partnerships, and a national network that could place their model on a map. It would mean more money, impressive slides, and the chance to put systems they had piloted into municipal contracts. The man spoke of impact metrics and a glossy feed of before and after portraits. He left the meeting with the pamphlet in his bag and a small mounting tension in his chest. At home, Chloe watched him unwrap the mail in a kitchen that smelled of boiled carrots and baby powder. Their son, Prentice, they had named him after a great-uncle who held a union card, sat in a high chair and batted at a spoon. Chloe read the pamphlet over his shoulder and folded her own hands on the counter. "We can say yes," she told him, "and get more people help. Or we can say yes and become what we didn't want to be."
Lucas thought of the man from the subway, of how accountability had started not as a spectacle, but as a sitting down in the subway station and being told what he needed to hear. He thought of the community boards, of the white envelopes and the forms, of nights spent at fluorescent-lit municipal rooms where people took different dimensions of his apology and shaped them into rules. The foundation's money felt, curiously, like another kind of ledger, a tempting arithmetic that could be reconciled in slides, but might not survive the test of arranging for the most fragile. They talked for a long hour, then for 3 more nights in the small ritual of marriage: argument, testing, surrender, small mercy. In the end, they declined the foundation. They refused heroism that arrived in a press release more than in steady paychecks to neighbors. It was a sacrifice of scale they had not anticipated making when they first set out to rebuild. It also preserved a certain closeness to the people they served, the ability to bow to the voice of a neighbor, to set terms that people could read and confront if they needed to. Refusal, however, did not shield them from scrutiny. The story of their refusal leaked in the way things do in cities, through a civic-minded newsletter that pitted small realness against large, effective money. A columnist framed Lucas as both stubborn and provincial, a man who had turned down a historic partnership for reasons that sounded to the writer like theatrical purity. The piece caricatured their careful, time-consuming measures as quaint and parochial. It suggested that ambition could have multiplied their work and that they had instead chosen to remain small. The reaction in the community was ambivalent. For some, the refusal confirmed the worst suspicions, that Lucas had, in his, at times, slow way, returned to his old arrogance. Others, those who had sat in his meetings, who had watched him sign restitution checks late at night, felt a cautious relief that he had chosen the hard, horizontal route over the vertical temptation of expansion at any cost. Then a more menacing test arrived. An investigative blog published documents showing that in one of the cooperative agreements Lucas's hub had brokered, an intermediary company had been paid for services that on paper looked like a redundant middleman.
The blog's headline asked whether Lucas had recycled funds for personal gain. The post suggested, without firm evidence, that some of the funds intended for workers' relief had been routed through a firm whose ownership was unclear. The comments section filled fast, with people ready to believe he had slipped back into old ways. The first week after the piece, Lucas's phone did not ring with offers of partnership. It rang with anger and suspicion. Old enemies used the article as ammunition. Local politicians leaned away. Even some of the community organizers who had worked with him earlier demanded a full accounting.
They were right to ask. The question was not whether he had built something worthy. The question was whether he would let it be dismantled by lack of clarity. He did not close ranks. He opened a ledger and invited anyone who wanted to see it. He spent nights at the hub, sorting receipts, calling accountants, tracking every invoice. He made the mistake, on purpose, of letting people watch the work happen. Community leaders who had once sat on panels with him now sat with him at folding tables and went through line items, vendors, payroll, matched grants. He answered with the flatness of someone who had learned that the penance of openness could be more valuable than the comfort of denials. At a public meeting called by a coalition of neighborhood groups, a woman named Rosa, who had herself once lost a store to corporate blight and who had received a small stipend from Lucas's hub while she retrained as a bookkeeper, stood up. Her voice was raw and sharp, but careful. "I don't know everything that happened before," she said, "but I know what I saw. I watched him hand a check to my neighbor when nobody else would. I watched him come back to ask how the fund worked after mistakes were found. If you want answers, ask them. If you want to tear things down without checking, you'll leave people on the sidewalk." Her statement did not silence the critics, but it redirected the scrutiny toward process. A committee was formed, volunteer-based and cross-neighborhood, with a charter and a timeline. The committee demanded audits. Lucas welcomed auditors into the files and into his humility. He told the committee plainly that if mistakes were found, he would correct them, and that he would accept structural changes the committee proposed. The members of the committee, to his surprise, made recommendations that were less vindictive than practical. Clearer procurement guidelines, a rule that any intermediary must be transparent, a buffer fund to cover delays. Weeks turned into an unglamorous season of paperwork. He attended meetings where he explained in the same voice he had used in the courtroom. No flourish, no evasion, only the strain of detailed accountability. Some days, after long hours, he would come home to Chloe and fall into the couch with the thought that the ledger could swallow him if he let it. But their small domestic rituals held. Dinners eaten slow when time allowed. The baby woken and fed in the middle of the night. Their voices low so as not to wake the neighbors who lived thinly on hope. When the committee issued its report, it found errors, administrative mistakes rather than theft, misaligned contracts, a lack of oversight in a hurried moment when the hub had boarded a subcontractor whose paperwork had not been properly vetted. The report recommended restitution for the money that could not be clearly traced to services, and recommended structural changes to ensure no future slips. Lucas accepted the finding in full. He sat down, water still shining on his palms, and thought of the foundation's offer from the previous year. This invitation felt narrower, slower, less likely to dissolve into a public relations campaign. It felt like the hard work of translation, helping another city learn how to make transparent contracts, how to nurture community oversight, how to name mistakes without trying to hide them. He accepted the invitation, but with terms written in the tired discipline of someone who had learned that generosity without structure quickly flattens into permissiveness. He proposed a covenant. They would travel, but not as celebrities. They would bring the cohort's curriculum and leave it with local people. They would insist on local governance, not centralized control. And they would require an independent audit at each stage. The other city agreed, and Lucas found himself on a train with a briefcase of papers and a refusal to perform. He was easy to misread now. Not the old executive who sought growth at any cost, but a man who had learned to carry restraint as a principle. Abroad in the other city, they sat with people who shared their hunger but had different scars. Lucas learned new vocabulary for old problems. How zoning rules can constrict hiring, how transportation deserts make steady work impossible, how local cultures reshaped standard procedures. He listened more than he prescribed. At the end of 3 days of workshops, a municipal official rose and said, "We need less shine here and more slow." And everyone laughed in the way people do when a joke lands exactly on the truth. Back home, the hub continued its slow, patient work. People who had once been suspicious now arrived to meetings with documents in hand and questions sharpened by necessity. The hub staff grew not by celebrity hires, but by people who had come through the program. A woman who had trained as a paralegal, a former warehouse manager turned trainer, a man who had once been evicted and now managed logistics. They were not there to decorate the program, they were there to hold the seams. In quiet moments between meetings, Lucas found himself thinking about the strange architecture of shame and repair. He had imagined, once upon a past life, that a public confession would be a personal lightening. Instead, confession had become a laborious opening, a willingness to let others map where the damage had been, and to keep showing up during the slow work of rebuilding. He learned, piece by piece, that accountability was not a slab to be placed and then admired, but a process with seasons, setbacks, and small victories. One evening, as twilight made the city glass into a trembling mirror, Chloe received a message from her sister. A small inheritance had been resolved. Nothing grand, but enough to pay for a child's small schooling without scraping. They used the money for a dent in the hub's budget and for a modest trip for their family to see the ocean for the first time.
Lucas sometimes thought about the performance of repentance, how easily public contrition can be staged, and how often it does little to heal the people whose lives were bruised. He tried to live the more difficult truth, that the work of repair demands patience, an appetite for paperwork, and an insistence on forms that could be checked. It was not glamorous, but it was real, and after a time it acquired its own gravity. On a Saturday in late spring, the hub held an open forum to mark 3 years since their first cohort. People who had been taught the basics of bookkeeping presented charts. 2 formerly incarcerated men led a panel on re-entry. Chloe stood at the back, watching as the room filled with faces whose stories were not reducible to charity or pity. Prentice, now toddling and proficient at overturning water cups, sat on her hip. When the panel ended, a woman from the audience approached Lucas and, without preamble, shook his hand. "My sister used to work at a plant that closed," she said. "We got nothing. When you opened this place, she came to learn a skill. Now she works at a co-op. She texted me this morning to say she bought a pair of shoes for her daughter. That's why I'm here."
It was an ordinary report of something small, the purchase of shoes, but it landed like a bell. Lucas felt, with a sudden sharpness, the ongoingness of the work. It was not the single stroke that erased his past mistakes, but the accumulation of hundreds of acts that made life steadier for someone else. That was the measure he had aimed for when he first sat down with apology in his mouth and the world watching. Not to remake the skyline, but to remake a few lives, so that the sum of small changes generated a different city. He left the forum with Chloe and walked home under an April sky bright with the possibility of rain. They passed a mural that someone had painted on a once derelict wall. An image of hands, many hands, joining across a stylized map of the city. Someone had scrawled a line beneath it. Hands hold what paper promises. Chloe read it aloud and laughed, not unkindly. "That's a better motto than any grant proposal," she said. Lucas thought of the subway man one last time that evening. Thought of him not as a ghost to be found, but as a persistent pattern. The right person at the right moment saying what needed to be said. He had not found the man again, and he did not expect to. Mercy and rebuke had once met him in a dim station. Since then, he had tried to make meetings happen in daylight, in rooms with rules and ledgers and clear recourse. The world, he understood more clearly, did not take the shape of a single dramatic line of salvation. It was a network of small obligations and the people who kept them.